This is lecture 15. For the last two lectures, we've covered basic introductory concepts of biomechanics. In this lecture, we'll cover levers, proper biomechanics. We'll go over some more definitions. This time it's terms that all apply to levers. And then we'll talk about the levers themselves and the three classes of levers. And we'll go over some examples of each. And we'll finish by talking about, and throughout we'll talk about this, mechanical advantages and disadvantages. And we'll have more examples for those. So a lever involves a lever arm. It's a rigid bar in the body. That means a bone moving on a fulcrum. Depending on the structure of the lever, it'll change the force required to move an object, or it'll change the speed that the object moves. In the image, you can see the moving object on the left side of the fulcrum and the force being applied on the right side of the fulcrum at the end of a really long lever arm. So some definitions here. Let's walk through the picture together because we'll cover all of these definitions that way. So we see the lever arm. That's the blue beam at the bottom. In this case, the lever arm is a forearm. The bones of the forearm, right, being the radius and ulna. So let's just say it's the radius because that's what the biceps muscle inserts on is the radius. So the lever arm is your forearm bone, right, the radius. The load or the resistive force, that would be the dumbbell in the hand. And then the muscle force would be the force generated by the biceps brachii, the force generated by the muscle from its insertion pulling toward its origin. You know all about how muscles flex. That's what this is, right? It's the muscle flexion that's generating force in the direction of its line of pull. And then there's the moment arm, not the lever arm, but the moment arm. And there are technically two of these. The moment arm of the muscle, which is sometimes called the moment arm of the force, as opposed to the moment arm of the load or the resistance. The moment arm of the muscle is seen here. It's the yellow beam. That's the moment arm of the muscle or the moment arm of the force. And it's the distance from the axis or the fulcrum, which in this case is just the elbow joint, to the line of pull of the muscle. Now, the moment arm of the load or of the resistance would essentially be the length of the lever arm here. It goes from the fulcrum, from the elbow, to the center of mass of the load. So there's a moment arm for the load and a different moment arm for the muscle, two totally different moment arms. And the ratio of those moment arms determines whether we have a mechanical advantage or disadvantage. But one thing to consider before talking about mechanical advantages and disadvantages is where your tendons insert. That matters. Uh, you can see where the biceps attach on the radius in this diagram, hypothetically, where it attaches in this picture. If the biceps attached farther away from the elbow, the moment arm of the muscle would be longer. And you can see that. You can see what it would look like. If the biceps attached closer to the elbow, the moment arm of the muscle would be shorter. Now, insertions vary a little bit from person to person, and these little bits affect our leverage, right? Levers, leverage. A tendon that inserts farther from the joint gives you more leverage, which is to say, more of a mechanical advantage. Uh, Although in this case, it would be less of a mechanical disadvantage. That's often what we're looking at. All right, so what do we mean by advantage and disadvantage? Here, pictured, we have a lever system. Technically, that's a class one lever, which is just a teeter-totter. And there are two people on the teeter-totter, and on the right is let's say it's like baby Beavis, and he's tiny, maybe he weighs 40 pounds, something like that. But he has the leverage here. He has a huge mechanical advantage. His moment arm is way longer. The moment arm of his force is much longer than the moment arm of his load, which is the Dursley kid from Harry Potter on the left. So a mechanical advantage is a ratio of moment arms in which the moment arm of the force or the muscle is longer than the moment arm of the resistance or the load. So that's how little Beavis is able to lift the big Dursley despite weighing less. His moment arm is just longer. That's all there is. So the three kinds of levers, on the far left, both top and bottom, that's a first class lever. The fulcrum is in the middle of the force and the load. On all of these diagrams, the load is the blue box, the force or the muscle is the red arrow, and the axis or the fulcrum is the green triangle. So the far left, that's a class one or a first class lever, and that's the teeter-totter. The fulcrum is in the middle, and it can have a mechanical advantage or disadvantage depending on where the load and forces are in reference to the fulcrum. We'll talk more about that soon. In the middle, both top and bottom, that's a second class lever. Classes two and three always have the fulcrum on one end. The fulcrum is not in the middle in a class two or three lever. But for a class two lever, the load is in the middle and the force is at the other end, which means it always has a mechanical advantage. Always the moment arm of the force or the muscle is longer than the moment arm of the load. And then on the right, again, top and bottom, that's a third class lever. Just like class two, the fulcrum is on one side of the lever, but unlike class two, what's in the middle is the muscle or the force. So a class two goes fulcrum load muscle, and a class three goes fulcrum muscle load, which means a class three lever always has a mechanical disadvantage. The moment arm of the muscle is always shorter than the moment arm of the load. So this is a look at a first class lever. You can see the axis in the middle, the fulcrum or axis or pivot point or joint, whatever you want to call it. That's the fulcrum. It's in the middle. And on opposite ends, you have the load and the force. Load is often called resistance. Force is often called muscle because muscles are what are creating the force in us, at least. That's what in a human being, that's what's creating the force. Um, so this is a first class lever. Again, first class can either have a mechanical advantage or disadvantage. In this case, the load and force are about equidistant from the fulcrum, so it's not really an advantage or disadvantage. Maybe the muscle's a tiny bit farther away, and if that's the case, then there would be a mechanical advantage here. But move that ball a little bit, and you'll change the moment arm of the load. You can increase the mechanical advantage by moving the ball closer to the fulcrum. So you're shortening the moment arm of the load, or you can introduce a mechanical disadvantage by moving the ball farther away. A second class lever, remember, is the fulcrum on one side, the load in the middle, and then the force on the far end. And this one always has a mechanical advantage because the force is always farther away than the load is, which means the moment arm of the force or the muscle is always longer than the moment arm of the load. So that's a second class lever. And a third class lever begins in the same way. The fulcrum is on one side, but here the force is in the middle, and then the load is on the far end. So this class always has a mechanical disadvantage because the moment arm of the load is necessarily longer than the moment arm of the force. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be a third class lever, which is what this is. So what kind of a lever is this? Looking at this picture, we've seen this image before, but what class of lever are we looking at, right? It's a teeter-totter. I'll start working through it slowly. Hopefully you have this in your mind already. But the fulcrum is in the middle, so that makes it a first class lever. From the perspective of the Dursley boy, he has a mechanical disadvantage. The little kid on the right would be Dursley's load. The moment arm of Dursley's muscular force is really short from Dursley to the fulcrum. That's really short. Um, the moment arm of his load is really long comparatively. It's really long. And that ratio again, determines whether there's an advantage or disadvantage. And here, if we're talking about Dursley, it's a mechanical disadvantage. Okay, so what kind of a lever are we looking at here? Is it a first class, second class, third class lever? The first thing to look at is where's the fulcrum? It's on one side, it's not in the middle, so we rule out first class. This is not a first class lever. It has to be either second or third class because the fulcrum is not in the middle. The next thing to consider is there a mechanical advantage or disadvantage? Meaning, is the moment arm of the muscle longer or is the moment arm of the load longer? If the moment arm of the muscle is longer, it's a second class lever. If the moment arm of the load is longer, it's a third class lever. In this case, it goes fulcrum, force, load. So the moment arm of the load is longer, which means this is a third class lever. So what about Elvis with his wood pile? Is this a first, second, or third class lever? Again, first thing to do, identify where the fulcrum is. Here, it's at the center of the wheel. That's the axis. That's where those handles pivot. They pivot at the middle of the wheel. That's the point of rotation of the handle. So that's the fulcrum. Next, where's the load? Well, it's the wood pile, the center of mass of the wood pile. That's the load. And then where is the muscle or the force? Where's that being applied? Elvis's hands. So what's our sequence? On the far left, at the wheel, we have our fulcrum. In the middle, the center of mass of the wood, we have our load. And then at the far end, at the far right, we have the muscle. So it goes fulcrum, load, force. Uh, we know it's not a first class lever because the fulcrum is on one end, right? It's not in the middle. The fulcrum is at the end. So it has to be either a class two or three lever. Class two is strong. Class three is weak. It's fast, but weak. We'll talk about that soon. Um, so is the moment arm of the muscle longer than the moment arm of the load? That would be a second class. And here, yes, it is. The hands are farther away from the axis than the wood is. So the moment arm of the muscle is longer than the moment arm of the load, which makes it a class two, a second class lever. So looking at these, can you tell which lever class is which? And can you tell whether there's a mechanical advantage or disadvantage also? The first thing to look for is the fulcrum in the middle. If the fulcrum is in the middle of the force and load, then that's a first class lever. So which one of these three has a fulcrum in the middle? The middle picture, that is a first class lever. Uh, Now, is there a mechanical advantage or disadvantage in the first class lever? Because remember, a first class lever can go either way. It can have an advantage or disadvantage based on where the force and load are. So in this case, the moment arm of the load um, is shorter. The moment arm of the load is shorter than the moment arm of the muscle or of the force. The moment arm of the force is visibly longer. And so it has a mechanical advantage. All right, so now which one is a second class lever? The second class lever always has a mechanical advantage. The fulcrum is on one side, and then the muscle is always farther away than the load. So which one of these images does that describe? The one on the right, the force is farther away from the fulcrum than the load is. So that's a second class lever. So that leaves the third class lever in which the fulcrum is on one side and there's a mechanical disadvantage. The load is farther away from the fulcrum than the force. And the image on the left, that's your third class lever. Fulcrum, force, load. Load is farther away, which means the moment arm of the load is longer than the moment arm of the muscle. Now, looking at body parts, actual muscles and joints, can you identify what class of lever you're looking at? So in the biceps brachii, right on the left, you see the fulcrum, the elbow joint. There's a black dot there. That's your axis. That's your fulcrum. That's where you pivot or rotate, right? That's where elbows flex and extend. So that's the fulcrum. And just past that, to the right, just past it, is the muscle attachment on the radius. The moment arm of the muscle, that's what MM stands for, is really short. The muscle attaches really close to the elbow, really close to the joint, the fulcrum. Much farther away is the load, the center of mass of that tiny dumbbell, right, the person is holding. That's the application of load. And so the moment arm of the load or the resistance moment arm of resistance is what MR stands for. That's really long. So that's a third class lever. The biceps have a huge mechanical disadvantage. All right, so what about the calf, the soleus and gastrocnemius? The axis here is at the base of the toes. That's where you're doing the bulk of your raising over there by your toes. And the weight is going to be your own center of mass. I mean, maybe you're carrying a box or you have a bar on your back or something like that, and that can move this a little bit. But the downward pointing arrow, that's the load, that's the resistance. The upward pointing blue arrow is the force of the muscle. The moment arm of the muscle is farther away from the fulcrum than the load is, which means this is a second class lever. The calves have a mechanical advantage. And then on the far right, that's the triceps. You see the elbow, the black dot, right? That's your fulcrum. The yellow arrow is the load, and the blue arrow is the muscle. And you can figure this one out, and you can figure out whether it has a mechanical advantage or disadvantage. Is the moment arm of the muscle longer or shorter than the moment arm of the load? Now, moment arms are not static throughout motion. They change depending on our body position. Where the weight is, how contracted or extended we are. Uh, and this is here is a study showing that the moment arm of the Achilles tendon changes during walking. I'll read this red highlighted passage. Using motion capture guided ultrasound imaging techniques, we recently discovered that the Achilles tendon moment arm changes continuously during walking, potentially reflecting the combined effects of kinematic, i.e., joint angle, and kinetic, i.e., muscle loading factors. The latter, presumably, an indirect effect of bulging during force production. So throughout the range of motion in an activity or whatever exercise you're doing, there will be some changes in moment arms. changes in leverage. And like, remember how that clap skate, that changed joint kinematics while ice skating and accordingly increased power by, as much as 10%. So this stuff changes. It's more dynamic. It's not static. Um, and of course, not every muscle is operating through a lever system because bones are the levers. Muscles aren't the levers, bones are. Muscles are the source of force upon those levers. So if you find a muscle that's not pulling on a bone in a way that causes rotation of a fulcrum, that's not a lever system. Most of our skeletal muscles, though, that's how they work. They work through lever systems. And when we exercise those muscles in the gym, lever systems are often manipulated in the exercise equipment itself, that like the selectorized equipment that you put the pin in. Um, this is the principle behind variable resistance exercise. As you go through the range of motion, there's a cam that rotates. And if that cam is a perfect circle, then the resistance will remain steady throughout the range of motion. But if the cam isn't a perfect circle, then when it rotates, the moment arm of the load will change. It will lengthen or it'll shorten, depending. If the moment arm of the load lengthens, moving that load will require more muscle force. If the moment arm of the load shortens, moving that load will require less muscle force. And remember, one of the principles we talked about earlier is the length tension relationship in skeletal muscle. In the middle of the range of motion, we have more optimal actin-myosin engagement. More cross bridges can be formed, actin-myosin bonds, more cross bridges can be formed in the middle of the range of motion. But when you're really contracted or really extended, not as many cross bridges can be formed. So what variable resistance training is attempting to do is mimic that relationship. It doesn't do a very good job usually, but it attempts to create a load that is proportional to the muscle's capacity throughout the range of motion. So instead of having a consistent load throughout the range of motion and inconsistent force production coming from the muscle, you can create a machine that has like, you know, 50% of the maximum voluntary contraction of your muscle at every point in the range of motion. That's the goal. Again, the equipment is never quite perfect or even really all that good in terms of how the load gets distributed throughout the range of motion, but that's the principle. That's the principle of variable resistance machines, is to match the load to the length tension relationship capacity of the muscle. Uh, and we have some muscles that function as a at a mechanical advantage. We talked about like the gastroc and soleus, the calves. Some muscles function at a mechanical advantage, but most of our muscles work at a disadvantage. And often it's a huge mechanical disadvantage. So the forces that we're generating internally to produce movement are greater than the measurable external forces we exert. And this is the opposite for muscles that have a mechanical advantage. But most muscles have a large disadvantage, and that helps us with speed. But the internal forces generated are higher than would be expected to accomplish the work upon the external load. So this is a very hypothetical question, obviously, but would a cheetah have a big bench press? Ignoring the fact that cheetahs can't like bend their elbows, right, in a way that's required for a bench press, and like they don't have thumbs, right? Maybe they'd be hard to hold a bar, and they wouldn't even understand like why they're like what are you supposed to do with it? Like, why am I doing this to the bar? So this isn't meant to be realistic, but just reflect on what you know about muscle fiber type, what we've talked about in past lectures and what you know now, what we're talking about now, regarding mechanical advantages and disadvantages. So think about that stuff. And let's start with muscle fiber type. Type 2 fibers have myosin isoforms, myosin heavy chain isoforms that contract much more quickly than type 1 isoforms. And type 2B fibers are even faster than 2X. 2X is our fastest, but cheetahs have a high proportion of 2B and 2X. So they have really fast myosin, cheetahs do. And fast myosin is strong myosin. It produces a lot of force. So would that mean that cheetahs would be really good power lifters, in addition to being good sprinters? Probably not, because think about the mechanics of force production. Having a mechanical advantage helps. Um, or at least, not having a huge disadvantage. The less disadvantageous your moment arms are, the more external force you'll be able to exert. So that makes you a good power lifter, but it comes at the cost of speed. Mechanical advantages are stronger, but slower. Mechanical disadvantages are faster, but they're weaker. So looking at the force speed trade-off, this image illustrates how it works. It can be a little bit hard to understand. So orient yourself well to the visual. Let's say it's an arm, right? That's the upper arm and the lower arm. The top line, right? There's two different diagrams here, and in each diagram, the top line is the humerus, your upper arm bone. And the lower line, that's the radius, right? The forearm bone that the bicep connects to. And the quote, lines depicting muscle lengths, those red lines, that's your bicep. And you're going through the range of motion of a bicep curl. You see the starting position at the bottom. As you curl the weight up, the biceps shorten. In both images, the origin of the biceps is in the same spot, but the insertions are different. That's what's different about these two diagrams is the insertion of the biceps on the radius on the lower line. Um, in the image to the left, the bicep inserts pretty close to the elbow, pretty close to the fulcrum. On the image to the right, the bicep inserts farther away from the elbow, farther down the radius, farther from the fulcrum. Now, in both of these, there's a mechanical disadvantage because it's a third class lever. The biceps are a third class lever, and third class levers always have a disadvantage. But the image to the right has less of a disadvantage because of where the biceps insert, where the insertion is. Um, so we know that the lever on the right, the lever system on the right, will be stronger. It'll be able to produce more force because it has less of a mechanical disadvantage. Just like yeah, that, like Beavis boy was able to lift the larger Dursley boy on the teeter-totter because of Beavis's mechanical advantage. If the biceps have less of a mechanical disadvantage, they'll be stronger. They'll be able to produce more force, but they'll also be slower. Now, each one of these forearm lines represents the movement associated with a specific amount of muscle shortening. If the sarcomeres contract at an exact amount, in both arms, you'll see the left forearm moving several degrees farther than the right forearm does because the muscle inserts closer to the joint. The closer to the joint it gets, the weaker its force production is going to be, but the farther the forearm will travel at a given amount of muscle shortening. Um, so as long as the muscle cells are capable of shortening at the same velocity, the forearm will move faster in the image to the left. So the closer the muscle attachment is to the fulcrum, the faster you're going to be, providing you can overcome the load. But the weaker your force production will be. So let's just look at some muscles we've already seen before, some images we've seen before, but up close. get a better understanding of them. This is the calf, the gastrocnemius, let's say, and the force generated by the muscle is pulling through the line of pull of that muscle. The load is going to be in the middle of the body, unless the body is weighted in a weird way. Um, and so it's going to be, let's just say it's not weighted in a weird way, right around the middle of this image. That's where the center of mass of the load is going to be. And then the pivot point, the axis or fulcrum, that's at the toes. So the distance from the fulcrum to the load is sort of short. And then the distance from the fulcrum to the muscle is slightly longer, which makes this a class 2 lever. Does this have a mechanical advantage? Yes. Second class levers always have a mechanical advantage. The moment arm of the muscle is always longer than the moment arm of the load. For the biceps, what kind of a lever is this? Just look at the elbow, right? That's the fulcrum. It's on one side. You see the little, black dot, and the load or the resistance that's on the other side. The muscle or the force that's in the middle, not perfectly in the middle. It's really close to the fulcrum, but it's between the fulcrum and the load. That makes this a third class lever. And do third class levers have a mechanical advantage or disadvantage? Always a disadvantage. In this case, it's a considerable one. The distance between the fulcrum and the load is really long compared to the distance between the fulcrum and the line of pull of the muscle. So it's a considerable mechanical disadvantage, but it is fast. This is a fast moving body segment. And onto the triceps. The line of pull of the triceps is behind the fulcrum. It's on the back side of your arm. The load applied at the hand is on the opposite side. So the muscle force is on one side of the fulcrum and the load is on the other. So that makes this a first class lever. Does it have a mechanical advantage? No. Another muscle here with a huge disadvantage. The moment arm of the muscle is really short compared to the moment arm of the load. And again, this is a fast lever system. You can move your forearm really quickly. But the enormous mechanical disadvantage of this lever cuts into the leverage of your heaving, right? You're faster than you are mighty. Okay, so what about this? It's a car jack. You can't just hoist the car with your hands, right? With your like bad back and your valgus knees. You need a mechanical advantage. And so that's what a car jack gives you. It gives you a mechanical advantage. And in this case, you see the moment arm of the muscle, it's labeled effort here, is longer than the moment arm of the load. That's how you're able to hoist the car, to lift the car. You have a large mechanical advantage. All right, so what about a shovel? What lever class is a shovel? It's easy to figure out because you can see like where the fulcrum is. Everything's labeled here. You can see where the fulcrum is. You can see where the effort or the muscle is, and you can see where the load is. So I'll let you answer this one by yourself. I'll just comment on the speed force trade-off. You can move that heap of gravel or like cremated grandmother, whatever it is, faster when it's in the shovel scoop than you could if it were scooped in your hands. Again, there's a speed force trade-off. And that's it for lecture 15. Make sure you can answer these questions and questions like them. So for instance, if I were to show you images of different lever systems, not a shovel and a wheelbarrow and a fishing rod and a car jack, but other tools and instruments, could you identify what lever class those things were and determine whether it has a mechanical advantage or disadvantage? But that's it for this lecture. I'll see you in lecture 16, where we talk about the factors that contribute to force production. both mechanical and physiological.